There's a video by Prager University entitled, "If You Live in Freedom, Thank the British Empire." Now, what is Prager University? Basically, in a nutshell, Prager University is an online echo chamber where people from the far right conglomerate and will spout all kinds of right-wing rhetoric, basically trying to justify Western intervention in the East and in Africa, and to justify their disgusting, homophobic, sexist, and transphobic beliefs, dressing it up in such beautiful sophistry that it seems more palatable to the rational mind. Now, basically, the entire slant of Prager University is to serve as sort of like a counter-attack against the left wing, to try and prove that the left wing are, in fact, emotionally driven, erroneous fools who don't know what they're talking about. So let's see if Prager University actually values facts over feelings. Let's go through it together, shall we? Okay.
Over the last 400 years, what power has done the most to spread the ideals of limited government, an independent judiciary, certain inalienable rights, and free markets? That power would be the British Empire. It was Britain that gave these ideals to the United States. It was the British Empire, the largest empire the world has ever known, which made these ideals global aspirations. It was the British Empire, along with America, that defended these ideals in two colossal world wars.
The British and the Americans were not the only players in the First and Second World War. You neglect to mention, of course, the French. You neglect to mention how the Russians routed and cornered Hitler. You neglect to mention, of course, the fact that what else? The Chinese were also fighting the Japanese. The British and the Americans were just two players in the Second World War, okay, and the First World War as well.
Freedom was an Englishman's right, and wherever he went, he took that right with him.
Yes, for they so loved the concept of freedom that they had to conquer and subjugate a quarter of the world just to impose that freedom on their native populations.
Whether he was an English colonist in America, governing himself through a locally elected assembly, or an English adventurer like Sir Stamford Raffles, creating the free market city-state of Singapore, or an English officer like T.E. Lawrence, leading Arab tribesmen against the Turks. The British always thought of themselves as liberators.
I can smell your white savior. I can smell your white savior complex from a mile away.
As bringers of freedom. The British believed the final and necessary justification of their empire was a moral one. The British kept the peace.
No. Let's hear that again.
Was a moral one.
Hey, it was the thirst for tea and the craving for spices which was what led the British Empire to annex India and China in the first place. Now, you see, in the past it was considered tea and spices were monopolized by China and India, okay? And Europeans, prior to the colonialism days, had to beg. They had to beg in order to do business with China and India to get these things because of their closed door policies. Now, because there was such a high demand for tea and for porcelain and for spices in the West, the British tried for hundreds of years to find a trade route to the east. And Columbus thought that he had achieved that trade route to India, not knowing, of course, he ended up in America. But the fact is that it was never about bringing morality to these cultures. Now, when the British developed sophisticated um, weaponry like guns, cannons, and all these things. By the way, gunpowder comes from China. It was then when they realized that, they didn't have to beg India and China anymore. They could take these things by force. And this is exemplified in you know, the Opium War of China, when China basically closed off its borders to Britain. They basically said that we are not going to do trade with you guys if you keep trying to smuggle opium into our country, to dumb down the masses of people so as to make it easier to trade with them. And the British took that as a provocation of war, and they launched 2 opium wars against China for refusing to do business with them. And this was a form of gunboat diplomacy. Do you ever wonder why the British never bothered invading, annexing, and conquering countries like Alaska? Why did they not bother conquering places like Alaska? Well, that's because there are no spices to be found in Alaska. So they could care less about civilizing those native savages. Okay, so there were people like Rudyard Kipling, for example, who were cheerleading for British imperialism in these eastern countries. So basically, Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, goes like this. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flutter folk of wild, your new caught sullen people, half devil and half child. So, yeah, the moral justification that the British used to quench their thirst for tea and their craving for spices was a moral one. It was the idea that these silly, ignorant natives need to be enlightened with the values of Judeo-Christian civilization, which, as a matter of fact, did not originate in the West. It originated in the East as well, but they conveniently neglect to mention that. They use spreading the holy book as a moral justification when, if you read between the lines, all you want is spices and tea and diamonds. Yes, which India had. And I believe Britain hasn't yet returned that Kohinoor diamond that was stolen from India. In fact, it's still on the English crown today. Come on. We all know that what you want is tea, diamonds, and spices, right? But you just have to couch it in such a way to make it more palatable to people who question the act of foreign intervention, just like the Americans use, bringing freedom and civilization to these barbaric Arab lands. But we all know what you want. Just get straight to the point. You want oil. That's all you want.
The British kept the peace. They brought sound, honest administration. And
King Akbar was able to keep the peace in a country as diverse as India, with people of as such a diverse spectrum of races and religions. Yet Akbar managed to do it pretty well. Akbar didn't need the British to help him with that. In fact, Queen Elizabeth I actually praised Akbar for his humanity and for his ability to govern such a great landmass with so many different people. Okay, so
as to the basic moral standards were honored. The British did not try to nation build in the way we think of it now. They were under no illusions about making Arabs or Afghans or Zulus into Englishmen.
Of course they weren't, silly Billy. I mean, you know, they did not make them into British subjects. Precisely so that if things got ugly, they would not have any need to protect them, that they would have no responsibility to them. Like, you know, when the Japanese attacked Singapore in the early 1940s, you know, the British government started warning British subjects in Singapore, but they kept the local Singaporean population, the Chinese, the Malays, and the Indians, they kept them in the dark, you know, and they very quickly evacuated people, their own citizens, from Singapore, while leaving the Singaporeans, the native Singaporeans. Well, I should say that Singapore wasn't officially a country back then, but leaving the natives to the mercy of the Japanese. And after Japan lost the war, they came back to Singapore to lord it over them. But then Singaporeans had realized by that point that, you know, the British Empire was not infallible and the white man was not God. Okay, so yeah, they could, you know, when times were good, of course they could lord it over the local population, you know, behaving like Maharajas, you know, getting the local population to massage their feet, things they would not expect of their own servants back in Britain. But when things got ugly, and because the locals had not been made into Britishers, of course they would have no responsibility to protect them when things got ugly.
They were more than content to leave people alone, to let them be themselves, to govern them with the lightest possible hand. In American history, we remember this when we think of the British Empire's so-called benign neglect. We can see it throughout the history of the British Empire. Think about the vast territory of the Sudan. It was governed by 140 British civil servants. Even Gandhi praised the British Empire, paraphrasing Jefferson, saying that he believed that the best government was the government that governed least, and that he found that the British Empire guaranteed his freedom and governed him least of all.
Okay, Jefferson is not exactly a pillar of morality, you know. I mean, Jefferson is a pretty weak pillar of morality to be using, you know, because this guy kept black slaves. This guy had children with one of his black slaves. Can there be such a thing as consent between a master and a slave? And to rub salt into the wound, Jefferson did not even bother freeing his black slaves before he died, you know. So Jefferson was a moral hypocrite whose sense of freedom was as pale as the color of his skin. And this Gandhi quote that he's using, I find that the British Empire guarantees my freedom
and governed him least of all.
This is one of the most intellectually dishonest moves that have been pulled by Prager University. Now, this Gandhi quote was from the time when Gandhi was a sycophantic British loyalist, because there was a point in time, you see, when Gandhi was a sycophantic British loyalist who hated Africans. Yes, there was a point in time, yes, when he was sycophantically loyal to the British Empire, because of course he was benefiting from that loyalty, from turning a blind eye on its atrocities to his own people. But after the Amritsar massacre in 1919, you know, that was when Gandhi changed his tune, and then he became an independence fighter. Okay, but before the Amritsar massacre of 1919, you can look it up, which showcased how brutal and barbaric the British could be. Yeah, Gandhi was just one of those sycophantic loyalists. So this quote was taken from the old Gandhi before he started his march for freedom. Yeah.
In the defense of freedom, the empire drew moral lines. No power did more to abolish slavery and the slave trade in the modern world than did the British Empire. The British Treasury spent enormous sums to liberate slaves and compensate slave owners in the Caribbean. The Royal Navy...
Yeah, except the British were one of the biggest exporters of and importers of slaves throughout most of the modern world.
Had as a primary duty the eradication of the slave trade, and in fact abolishing the slave trade became a major factor driving the expansion of the British Empire. The British enforced a Pax Britannica, putting down pirates, taming headhunters, and keeping the peace between previously warring tribes and religions. While respecting and often ruling through local leaders, the British still insisted on certain Judeo-Christian moral standards. They were not, in that respect, multiculturalists.
Judeo-Christian moral standards. You mean like, I don't know, stoning somebody for working on Sunday, or putting heretics to death, as they used to do?
They had a firm sense of right and wrong. When Sir Charles Napier was confronted by the practice of suttee, widow burning, in India, he told the Brahmin priests involved that he understood it was their custom. But the British had a custom too. They hanged men who burned women alive and their goods were confiscated. So if the Brahmins insisted on continuing their tradition of widow burning, then he would insist on following his British tradition of hanging the murderers of widows.
Hang on. The British were very, very tolerant of sati in the early days of the empire. You know, there are records of British people, of British governors, even watching the practice of sati and just observing, and they were like, you know, they could care less that widows were getting burned alive. Okay, I mean, it's good that Charles Napier actually stepped in to condemn the practice of sati, which was practiced only by, you know, a very small minority of Hindus. It wasn't the mainstream practice of India. And even before the British landed in India, steps were already taken by reformists to try and outlaw the practice of sati. So to say that, to try and take credit for this is extremely chauvinistic, and it's extremely intellectually dishonest.
Widow burning in India soon ceased. But we don't have to dig far into history, into the abolition of slavery and widow burning, to find the British Empire on the side of moral right and freedom. We can think of events within our own lifetimes or those of our parents and grandparents. When we think of the two deadliest threats to freedom in the 20th century, we generally think of communism and Nazism. But how many remember that in 1940, after the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and after the fall of France, one power, the British Empire, stood alone in mortal combat against the combined tyrannies of the world?
Unless you forget, of course, that it was the Soviets who routed and cornered Hitler. It was the Soviets who did the brunt of the fighting against Nazi Germany.
Even where the British have merited criticism, as in Ireland, there is more to the imperial story. During negotiations to create the Irish Republic, for instance, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who could speak Welsh, reminded the Irish nationalist and Gaelic extremist Eamon de Valera that the Celts never had a word for republic. It was an idea given to them by the English. This is our own history too. If you love America, you should also love the power that gave us our sense of inalienable rights. Rights traceable back to Magna Carta. It all started.
The Magna Carta was not a document that gave inalienable rights to every single human being. Now, the Magna Carta was a medieval document meant to curb the power of King John, who was trying to tax the barons, at unreasonable rates. Basically, the king could tax the barons of England willy-nilly, and they had to pay whatever rate of taxation he declared. So the barons were not really happy about this, and they got together to create this document called the Magna Carta, which basically is seen as a milestone for human rights. But it wasn't done with some altruistic, noble purpose in mind. It was done to safeguard the pockets of the barons. It wasn't done in order to give liberty to the common man. In fact, in that time, only the ruling classes were able to read the Bible, because the Bible was only written, it was only read in Latin. So only a select few of the elite were allowed to read the Bible, and the rest of them had to use, clergymen among the elite as their interpreters. So it was a way of maintaining control over the masses, who were very, very, very fervently religious. So to say that the Magna Carta is a milestone in human rights is really a joke, because, when people were actually killed for translating the Bible into English, like I think it was William Tyndale, if I'm not mistaken, who about 100 years, slightly over 100 years after the Magna Carta was written, there was a guy named Tyndale who translated the Bible from Latin into English to make it accessible to the modern man. To the common man? What happened to him? He was killed for it. He was killed as a heretic, right? So the Magna Carta, yes, while it did set the stage for constitutional monarchy, the intention of the Magna Carta was not to give inalienable rights to the peasant classes and to religious minorities, because it was simply a way of safeguarding the pockets of the barons.
Started in America.
They were just as the barons continued to lord it over the local population just as brutally as they always did.
With the British Empire, a great liberty-loving empire. It is the empire's legacy, the English-speaking world, that remains the great global guardian of freedom today. I'm H.W. Crocker from Prager University. Thanks for watching. Keep our...
Oh, it's extremely nauseating to watch people gloating about how the British brought freedom, democracy, modern technology, modern medicine, and human rights to countries like India, as if it were part of their noble crusade to help the half-devil, half-child savages who needed their help. But in reality, all these things were brought into India, countries like India, not to help the local population, but in order to benefit the British who were living in those places, the British colonists who were living in those places. Okay? So, the West shouldn't be trying to take credit for things which were introduced into India or other colonies purely by accident. Okay? It was not done with the intention to serve the natives' best interests. And one must be ludicrous to think that Queen Victoria actually spent sleepless nights worrying about the welfare of her native subjects. Okay, so it was, one must be ludicrous to think that, you know, judging by the way the British treated the Indians before their freedom, like they used to make them, they used to kick their servants, sometimes to death. They used to make them crawl on their knees like dogs. And Kipling described them as half devil and half child. He described native people in such dehumanizing language, like half devil and half child. And in fact, you know, let me tell you, after General Dyer, this guy who was behind the Amritsar massacre, in which over 400 Indians were killed for organizing a peaceful gathering, a peaceful protest. This guy had £26,000 raised up for him by the British newspapers. He was hailed in Britain as a hero, as you know, as a guy who took tough measures in order to combat rebellion among the local populace. You know, so Kipling donated money to him. Kipling actually donated money to him, you know, and he was hailed by Kipling as a savior of, I think it was called a savior of the man who saved India. So to think that the British did not rule India and their colonies with an iron fist is erroneous. They were barbaric in many respects, and it's easy to whitewash history when you have a bunch of listeners who don't do their historical research. Okay.